Russia is the largest country on Earth. It spans 11 time zones, covers over 6.6 million square miles, and stretches from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It's bigger than Pluto, bigger than the entire continent of Antarctica. You could fit the United States inside Russia almost twice. But here's the trillion-ruble question. Does all this land make Russia rich? Or does its massive size actually hold back its economic potential? Today, we're diving deep into the economic geography of Russia. We'll explore how its vast territory shapes everything from natural resource extraction to infrastructure costs, from regional inequality to global trade relationships. By the end of this video, you'll understand why Russia's size is simultaneously its greatest asset and its biggest challenge. Let's begin. To understand how size influences Russia's economy, we first need to grasp just how enormous this country really is. Russia covers approximately 6.6 million square miles. That's roughly 11% of the world's total land area. When it's morning in Moscow, it's already evening in Vladivostok, 5,600 miles away. The Trans-Siberian Railway, the world's longest railway line, takes 7 days to traverse the country from Moscow to Vladivostok. But Russia isn't just big, it's also incredibly diverse geographically. The country contains virtually every type of climate zone and terrain. Frozen Arctic tundra in the north, vast coniferous forests called taiga, covering much of Siberia, fertile steppes in the south, mountain ranges in the Caucasus and along the Pacific coast, and even subtropical regions near the Black Sea. Here's where things get interesting from an economic perspective. Russia's 144 million people are not evenly distributed across this vast territory. About 77% of Russia's population lives in the western part of the country, the European portion, even though this represents only about 23% of Russia's total land area. The population density drops dramatically as you move east into Siberia and the Russian Far East. Moscow, the capital, is home to over 12 million people. St. Petersburg has about 5 million. But vast stretches of Siberia have fewer than one person per square kilometer. Some regions are virtually uninhabited. Why does this matter economically? Because economic activity requires people, workers, consumers, and entrepreneurs. Having enormous territory with few people means massive infrastructure must be built and maintained to connect relatively small population centers across incredible distances. Russia's size also means dealing with some of the harshest climates on Earth. Much of the country experiences long, brutal winters with temperatures regularly dropping below -40 degrees Celsius in Siberia. Yakutsk, one of the coldest cities in the world, has winter temperatures averaging around -40 degrees Celsius. This climate imposes massive economic costs. Buildings must be specially constructed to withstand extreme cold. Heating costs are enormous. Permafrost, permanently frozen ground, covers about 65% of Russian territory, making construction extremely expensive and complicated. Roads, railways, and pipelines must be engineered to handle freeze-thaw cycles that would destroy normal infrastructure. The agricultural growing season is short in most of Russia. Only about 13% of Russian land is suitable for cultivation, and much of that requires significant investment to be productive. This geographical reality has shaped Russia's economy for centuries. Now, let's talk about Russia's greatest economic asset: its extraordinary natural resource wealth. Russia's vast size isn't just empty space. It sits atop some of the world's largest deposits of oil, natural gas, minerals, and metals. The numbers are staggering. Russia has the world's largest proven natural gas reserves, about 48 trillion cubic meters, representing roughly 20% of global reserves. It has the sixth largest oil reserves globally, with about 80 billion barrels. Russia is the world's largest exporter of wheat and a major agricultural producer despite its climate challenges. It has massive reserves of coal, iron ore, nickel, platinum, palladium, diamonds, gold, and rare earth elements. Russia contains about 20% of the world's forests, making it a major timber producer. This resource wealth generates enormous revenues. Energy exports, oil and natural gas, account for about 40 to 50% of Russia's federal budget revenues and around 60% of its total exports. Natural resources are the backbone of the Russian economy. Russia's size allows it to be a crucial energy supplier to both Europe and Asia. Before recent geopolitical tensions, Russia supplied about 40% of Europe's natural gas imports and significant amounts of oil. The country has also been building massive pipeline infrastructure to supply energy to China and other Asian markets. This energy superpower status gives Russia significant geopolitical influence and economic leverage. Countries dependent on Russian energy must consider Moscow's interests in their foreign policy calculations. But here's the paradox. This natural resource abundance may actually harm Russia's long-term economic development. Economists call this the resource curse, or Dutch disease. Here's how it works. First, commodity dependence creates economic volatility. When oil and gas prices are high, Russia's economy booms. When prices crash, as they did in 2014 and 2020, the economy suffers severe recessions. Russia's GDP growth is highly correlated with global energy prices. Second, resource wealth can crowd out other industries. Why invest in developing competitive manufacturing or high-tech sectors when you can just pump oil and gas from the ground? Resource extraction requires relatively few workers but generates massive revenues, creating an economic structure that's profitable but doesn't develop diverse competitive industries. Third, resource revenues strengthen the currency, making other exports less competitive. When oil prices are high, the ruble strengthens, making Russian manufactured goods more expensive on world markets. This makes it even harder for non-resource industries to compete globally. Fourth, resource wealth enables political systems that may inhibit economic development. When governments can fund themselves through resource revenues rather than taxing citizens, they may be less accountable and less focused on creating conditions for broad-based economic growth. Russia's size also makes resource extraction more difficult and expensive. Many of the most valuable deposits are in remote, harsh environments: the Arctic, Eastern Siberia, or the Far East. Extracting resources from these areas requires massive infrastructure investments. You need to build roads or railways to access the deposits, construct facilities capable of operating in extreme cold, house and supply workers in remote locations, and build pipelines or other transport infrastructure to get the resources to market. These projects are so expensive that they often only make economic sense when commodity prices are very high, or when the state provides significant support and subsidies. Russia's gigantic size creates enormous infrastructure challenges. Moving people, goods, and resources across such distances requires massive investment in transportation networks, and these networks are expensive to build and maintain. Russia has about 87,000 kilometers of railway lines, including the famous Trans-Siberian Railway. Railways are the backbone of Russian freight transport, carrying about 45% of all freight by volume. But even this extensive network is insufficient for a country of Russia's size. Roads are even more challenging. Russia has about 1.5 million kilometers of roads, but only about 70% are paved. Many rural areas, especially in Siberia and the Far East, have limited road access or are only accessible during certain seasons. Some remote communities can only be reached by air or by ice roads during winter. Transport costs and economic competitiveness. High transportation costs affect Russia's economic competitiveness in several ways. First, domestic commerce becomes expensive. Shipping goods from one part of Russia to another can cost more than shipping internationally. A company in Vladivostok might find it cheaper to import from China or South Korea than to buy from European Russia. Second, it creates isolated regional economies. Rather than functioning as a single integrated market, Russia often operates as a collection of regional economies with limited interaction. This reduces competition, limits specialization, and prevents the efficiency gains that come from large, integrated markets. Third, it makes manufacturing less competitive. When it costs so much to move components and finished goods around, Russian manufacturers face built-in cost disadvantages compared to competitors in more compact countries with better infrastructure. Providing electricity, heating, water, and communications across Russia's vast territory is extraordinarily expensive. Power grids must span thousands of kilometers. Heating systems must function in extreme cold. Water and sewage systems must be engineered to prevent freezing. In many remote areas, the cost of connecting to national infrastructure networks is prohibitive. Some communities rely on diesel generators for electricity, which is far more expensive than grid power. Others use outdated, inefficient Soviet-era infrastructure that's costly to maintain and operate. Even in the digital age, Russia's size creates challenges. Building fiber optic networks across Siberia is expensive. Satellite communications help but have limitations in bandwidth and latency. While major cities have modern internet infrastructure, rural and remote areas often have poor connectivity. This digital divide limits economic opportunities. It's hard to participate in the modern digital economy without reliable, high-speed internet. Building infrastructure across Russia's vast territory is expensive, but maintaining it is a never-ending challenge. Harsh weather accelerates wear and tear. Freeze-thaw cycles damage roads and railways. Remote locations make repairs difficult and expensive. Russia faces a chronic infrastructure deficit. Much of the infrastructure inherited from Soviet times is aging and deteriorating. Upgrading and replacing it requires massive investment. Investment that must compete with other priorities in the federal budget. Because of its vast territory, Russia experiences deep economic inequality between its regions. In many ways, there are multiple Russias: wealthy urban centers versus struggling rural areas, resource-rich regions versus resource-poor ones, well-connected Western regions versus isolated Eastern territories. Moscow alone generates about 20% of Russia's GDP, despite having less than 10% of the population. Moscow and St. Petersburg together account for over 25% of national economic output. These two cities have income levels comparable to moderately wealthy European countries. But travel to rural areas in Siberia or the Far East, and you'll find poverty rates several times higher, with incomes a fraction of Moscow's levels. Some rural communities lack basic infrastructure and economic opportunities. Regions with natural resources tend to be wealthier, at least in terms of regional budgets. Oil and gas-producing regions receive significant revenues from extraction, but this wealth doesn't always translate into broad-based prosperity. Resource extraction is capital-intensive but doesn't employ many people. A region might have massive oil revenues but still have high unemployment and underdeveloped non-resource sectors. The benefits of resource wealth often flow to state budgets or large companies, rather than creating widespread local prosperity. Russia faces significant internal migration from rural and remote areas to major cities, particularly Moscow and St. Petersburg. Young, educated people leave small towns and remote regions seeking better opportunities, leaving behind aging populations and declining communities. This creates a vicious cycle. As educated young people leave, local economies decline further, making regions even less attractive. Schools, hospitals, and businesses close. Infrastructure deteriorates. The remaining population ages and shrinks. Most Russian regions cannot fund themselves from local tax revenues. About 70% of Russian regions are net recipients of federal transfers. They receive more from the federal government than they contribute in taxes. Only a handful of regions, mainly Moscow, resource-rich areas, and a few industrial centers, are net contributors to the federal budget. This means the federal government must constantly redistribute resources from wealthy regions to poorer ones, just to maintain basic services and infrastructure across the vast country. This system creates economic dependence and can reduce incentives for regional development. If your regional budget depends mainly on federal transfers rather than local economic activity, there's less pressure to create conditions for local economic growth. While we've focused mainly on economic challenges, Russia's size provides significant geopolitical and security advantages that have economic implications. Russia's vast territory provides strategic depth, the ability to absorb attacks and retreat into the interior. This defensive advantage has been crucial throughout Russian history. Napoleon and Hitler both discovered that conquering Russia's western regions doesn't mean controlling the country. There's always more territory to retreat into, and supply lines become impossibly stretched. This security from invasion has allowed Russia to avoid the devastation that repeated invasions have inflicted on smaller countries. This stability, while punctuated by major wars, has supported long-term economic development. Resource security and autarky. Russia's size and resource wealth mean it can achieve a level of economic self-sufficiency that few other countries can match. Russia can theoretically survive economic isolation better than most nations because it has abundant energy resources, sufficient agricultural land to feed its population, most critical minerals and metals, timber and fresh water, a large domestic market. This makes Russia less vulnerable to sanctions and economic pressure than smaller countries. When Western nations imposed sanctions after 2014 and 2022, Russia could lean on this self-sufficiency. It's economically painful, but Russia can survive in isolation in ways that, say, Germany or Japan cannot. Russia's position straddling Europe and Asia gives it unique geographic leverage. It can serve as a land bridge between two of the world's most important economic regions. The Northern Sea route along Russia's Arctic coast is becoming increasingly important as Arctic ice melts due to climate change. This route could dramatically shorten shipping times between Europe and Asia, and Russia controls access to it. Russia's pipeline networks give it leverage over energy importers. Countries that depend on Russian energy must consider Moscow's interests. Geography gives Russia power. However, Russia's size also creates security burdens with economic costs. Defending 60,000 kilometers of borders requires massive military spending. Russia maintains one of the world's largest militaries, with troops, bases, and equipment spread across vast distances. Russia spends about 4 to 5% of GDP on defense, significantly higher than most developed countries. This military spending diverts resources from economic development, infrastructure, education, and healthcare. Throughout the 20th century, Russia's and the Soviet Union's approach to its vast territory shaped economic development. The Soviets pursued an ambitious strategy of developing the entire country, including remote regions. They built entire cities in Siberia to support resource extraction or manufacturing. They constructed massive infrastructure projects, railways, canals, power stations across the wilderness. This was only possible under a centrally planned economy with unlimited state resources and often forced labor. The Soviet state could order projects built regardless of economic viability. Cities like Norilsk, above the Arctic Circle, were developed to exploit mineral resources despite extremely harsh conditions. While this created a certain level of development across the territory, much of it was economically inefficient. Many Soviet-era industrial cities are now struggling because they were built in locations that don't make economic sense in a market economy. After the Soviet collapse in 1991, Russia faced the challenge of transitioning to a market economy while managing its vast, unevenly developed territory. The 1990s were economically catastrophic for much of Russia. GDP fell by about 40%. Many of the uneconomic Soviet-era industries collapsed. Remote regions that depended on subsidized Soviet enterprises were devastated. The resource boom of the 2000s, when oil prices soared, helped stabilize the economy. But it also reinforced Russia's dependence on natural resource exports rather than developing competitive manufacturing or service sectors. Today, Russian policymakers face difficult choices about how to develop such a vast country. Should they try to develop the entire territory evenly, or concentrate resources on the most economically viable regions? Should they continue subsidizing remote communities, or allow population consolidation in more productive areas? Should they focus on resource extraction, or try to diversify the economy despite the challenges? These aren't just economic questions, they're also political and social ones. Abandoning remote regions would be politically difficult and would undermine Russian control over distant territories. Russia has repeatedly attempted to diversify its economy away from resource dependence, with limited success. The country has skilled workers, strong educational traditions in science and engineering, and successful sectors like aerospace and nuclear energy. But competing globally in manufacturing or high-tech sectors is difficult when you face structural disadvantages from high transportation costs, harsh climate, and infrastructure challenges that smaller countries don't have. Russia has had some success in digital services and IT, sectors where physical geography matters less. But overall, the economy remains heavily dependent on natural resources, and Russia's vast size is a significant reason why diversification has been so difficult. So, does Russia's mind-blowing size make it rich or hold it back? After exploring all these factors, what's the answer? The honest answer is both. Russia's size is simultaneously its greatest asset and its greatest challenge. The advantages are real. Enormous natural resource wealth that generates substantial revenues. Strategic depth and security from invasion. Self-sufficiency in critical resources. Geographic leverage over trade routes and energy supplies. A large domestic market. But the disadvantages are equally real. Massive infrastructure costs that strain federal budgets. High transportation costs that reduce economic competitiveness. Harsh climate that increases costs across all sectors. Regional inequality and isolated underdeveloped areas. Resource curse dynamics that inhibit economic diversification. Population concentrated in one part of the country, leaving vast areas nearly empty. It's instructive to compare Russia to other large countries. Canada faces some similar challenges: vast territory, harsh climate, population concentrated near one border. But Canada has the advantage of being next to the wealthy US market and has successfully diversified its economy. Australia also has vast territory with concentrated population, but a more temperate climate in populated areas and strong trade relationships with Asian economies. The United States is large but has much better infrastructure, more temperate climate in most populated areas, ocean access on both coasts, and a more integrated internal market. For Russia, the key question isn't whether size is good or bad. It's how to maximize the advantages while minimizing the disadvantages. This means investing heavily in infrastructure to reduce internal transportation costs. It means diversifying the economy to reduce resource dependence. It means developing remote regions strategically rather than trying to develop everything equally. It means leveraging geographic position for trade and transit. And it means using resource revenues to invest in long-term development rather than just current consumption. To sum it up, Russia's geographical size shapes every aspect of its economy, from the natural resources it extracts to the infrastructure it must build, from regional inequality to geopolitical influence, from development strategies to daily transportation costs. Size has given Russia tremendous natural wealth and strategic advantages. But it has also imposed enormous costs and created structural economic challenges that persist to this day. Whether Russia's massive territory ultimately proves to be more blessing than curse depends on the choices Russian policymakers make, and on global factors like commodity prices, climate change, and international trade relationships. What's certain is that understanding Russia's economy is impossible without understanding its geography. Size matters, and for Russia, it matters more than almost anywhere else on Earth. Thanks for watching. If you found this analysis helpful, please like and subscribe for more deep dives into economic geography and global economics. What aspect of Russia's economic geography surprised you most? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, stay curious,